The stars above twinkled like distant candles in the sky. Below them, the vast planet of Verda stretched out in all directions, a world that had once been home to the exiled colony. For 10 long years, it had been silent. No ships, no news, just empty spaces where families had once lived and worked. Now, all of a sudden, the silence was broken. Commander Grishka stood on the bridge of the returning ship, staring out at the blue-green world below. Her fingers tightened around the railing as she felt a knot form in her stomach. The planet looked so different from how she remembered it. Back then, it had been a place of hope, a place where they had built their future. Now, after years of struggle, it felt like a foreign world. "We're almost there," Commander said, one of the crew members, a young officer named Oran. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of anxiety behind his words. After all, no one had been to Verda since they had been exiled. There were rumors that the people they had left behind had thrived, but no one knew for sure. No one had dared to go back. Grishka nodded, her face set in a hard expression. "Prepare for landing. Inform the crew. We need to be ready for anything." She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This was no ordinary mission. The colony had fallen apart, the resources running dry, and the leadership had turned on each other. After a decade of failure and loss, they had nowhere else to turn. They needed help, help from the very people they had once abandoned. The exiled colony, once proud and full of hope, had become a shell of what it had been. They had tried to survive on their own, but the alien threat looming on the horizon had made that impossible. Now they had no choice but to return and beg for help. As the ship descended toward the surface, Grishka's mind raced. Would the survivors welcome them back, or would they be seen as enemies? The exiles had left them to fend for themselves after all. They had promised them safety and resources, but they hadn't delivered. The settlers who had been left behind might have found peace, but they were now strong, resourceful, and independent. The exiles were no longer in control. Landing in 5 minutes, Oren said again, breaking her thoughts. Grishka forced herself to focus. They had to be prepared. Below, the landscape of Verda was spread out like a patchwork of green forests and wide plains. In the distance, she could make out the faint outline of a settlement, a small cluster of buildings that had once been a thriving colony. The buildings looked different now, older, perhaps even more primitive, but there were signs of life. Smoke curled up from chimneys, and the faint hum of machinery could be heard in the distance. The settlers had made it, even without the support of the exiles. They had survived, and they had built a life for themselves. As the ship touched down, Grishka could feel her heart beat faster. This was it, the moment of truth. Would they find refuge here, or would they be turned away? She quickly turned to Oran. "Get the teams ready. We're going out there." The crew moved swiftly, preparing for the landing. Grishka stood at the front, her gaze fixed on the settlement. She could see movement in the distance, people gathering, watching the ship as it landed. Her stomach twisted. The settlers had to know they were coming. They had to know that the exiles were back. "Commander, it looks like they're waiting for us," Oren said, his voice tense. "They must have known we were coming." Grishka nodded, but inside, she felt a deep unease. They had come with hope, but it was quickly becoming clear that things were not going to be easy. The settlers were no longer the people they had known. They had adapted, grown stronger. The tables had turned. The hatch of the ship opened, and Grishka stepped out, her boots crunching against the ground. The air was thick with the scent of the forest, the same scent she remembered from years ago. The planet hadn't changed much, but everything else felt different. She was different. The settlers stood in a tight group, watching her every move. There was no welcoming cheer, no smiles, just silent faces. Grishka took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation ahead. The leader of the settlers stepped forward. She was tall and strong, her face hard but not unkind. Grishka recognized her immediately. It was Aska, the woman who had taken charge after the exile. "You've come back. Aska said, her voice steady but filled with something Grishka couldn't quite place. Anger, perhaps, or betrayal. Why? Grishka swallowed. We need your help. The colony is falling apart. We. She hesitated, struggling to find the words. We were wrong to leave you. We need refuge, supplies, anything you can spare. The alien threat is closing in, and we can't survive alone. Aska studied her for a long moment. And why should we help you? You left us here to die. You promised us a future, and you abandoned us. Her eyes narrowed. You want help. You'll have to earn it. Grishka felt her face flush, but she didn't back down. We made mistakes. We know that, but we have no choice. If we don't work together, we'll all be destroyed. For a long time, Aska said nothing. Then, with a sharp nod, she turned and motioned for Grishka to follow. Come with me. We'll talk. But don't think for a moment that you'll get our help without proving you've changed. Grishka followed her, feeling the weight of the moment. The path ahead was uncertain, and there was no guarantee of success. But for the first time in years, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what they had lost. The sun hung low in the sky as Commander Grishka followed Aska through the narrow streets of the settlement. The air smelled like fresh earth and wood, a scent Grishka hadn't realized she missed until now. The settlement had the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of a place that had learned to live without fear, without the constant weight of survival pressing on its people. But beneath that calm, Grishka knew there was something more. Something sharp, something dangerous. Aska led her to a large building at the center of the settlement. It was made of wood and stone, with vines growing up its walls, but inside, Grishka could see it was well organized and functional. The settlers had built something strong here, not just a home but a community. She couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. The colony had once been part of something like this. Together, they had dreamed of a future. But now, it felt like a lifetime ago. They entered the building, and Grishka's eyes adjusted to the dim light inside. The walls were lined with shelves full of books, tools, and strange devices she didn't recognize. It was a mix of old-world technology and newer, more practical inventions. The people who had stayed behind had clearly thrived without the advanced technology the exiles had brought with them. Have a seat, Aska said, gesturing to a wooden table in the center of the room. She took her place at the head of the table, her eyes still studying Grishka carefully. The others, several men and women who appeared to be leaders or advisors, sat around the table, watching the commander closely. Grishka hesitated before sitting down. The tension in the room was thick, and she could feel the weight of their distrust. She cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. We've come because we need your help, she began. The colony is facing destruction, and we have nowhere else to turn. We made mistakes, yes, but we're not here to argue or place blame. We need you, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust. Aska leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. What makes you think we should help you? You left us to survive on our own. Grishka, you promised us that we'd be okay, that we'd have a future. Instead, you abandoned us. And now you come crawling back, asking for help. The bitterness in her voice cut through the air like a blade. Grishka winced but didn't look away. She couldn't afford to look weak. Not now. I know we can't undo the past, she said, her voice steady. But we can still make things right. The aliens, they're coming. We've seen their ships. They're bigger, stronger, and faster than anything we have. We can't stop them on our own. If we don't work together, they'll destroy everything. Your people, my people, all of us. Aska's expression softened for just a moment, but it was gone before Grishka could take comfort in it. Why should we believe you? What's to stop you from leaving again once you get what you want? We've done fine without you. Better than fine, actually. Grishka's mind raced. She could feel her pulse quicken, the weight of her words pressing down on her chest. How could she convince them? How could she make them see the truth in her eyes? She glanced around the room, at the faces of the settlers. They were watching her closely, waiting for her to say something that would convince them. But there was nothing she could say to erase the past. No easy words could heal the wounds they had caused. "We'll stay," she said, the words slipping from her lips before she could think better of them. "We'll stay, and we'll fight with you. We'll do whatever it takes to make things right. But we need your help. We need your resources, your knowledge. We need you to stand with us, or we all lose." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. No one spoke. No one moved. Grishka could feel her breath growing shallow, her hands clammy against the table. Aska's eyes bored into hers, and for a moment, it felt like everything hung in the balance. Finally, Aska spoke. "You'll have to prove it. You'll have to show us that you're not just here for yourselves. We've worked hard to get to where we are, and we won't risk it all for a promise. You'll have to earn our trust." Grishka nodded. She didn't expect an easy answer. "What do you need me to do?" Aska leaned forward, her fingers tapping against the table. "First, I want to see what your people are capable of. You're asking for our help, but what can you bring to the table? We've survived on our own for a decade, and we're not going to risk everything for a group of people who think they can fix everything with their fancy technology." Grishka's stomach tightened. She had expected something like this. The settlers had learned to rely on their own skills, not the technology of the exiles. They had built their society from the ground up, with hard work and determination. And now she had to prove that the exiles could contribute to that. They had to show their worth. "I understand," Grishka said, trying to keep her voice calm. "We can offer our technology, our knowledge. We've developed new weapons, new systems that could help us fight the aliens. But if you want to see what we're really made of, I'm willing to take on any task you give me. We can start small, work our way up." Aska studied her for a long moment, then stood up. "All right then. We'll start with something simple. You'll go out into the field with us. Help us gather resources. Show us that you can handle the basics. If you can prove yourself, we'll talk about the bigger things." Grishka stood as well, her jaw set. This was it. The first test. If they could not prove themselves here, there would be no second chance. "Understood," she said, her voice firm. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Grishka and Aska gathered the small group of settlers. The air had cooled, and a light breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves. The sounds of the settlement were fading, replaced by the more distant calls of animals in the wild. Grishka stood at the front of the group, watching as the settlers prepared their equipment. This wasn't the mission she had imagined when she first landed on Verda, but she couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. She had to prove herself worthy of their trust. Aska walked over to her, her face serious. "We leave at dawn. The forest holds more than just animals. You'll need to be careful." Grishka nodded. "I'm ready." They had decided to gather supplies for the upcoming battle, as well as scout for any signs of the alien force they feared was coming. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Grishka could see the distrust in the eyes of the settlers. They were watching every move she made, waiting for her to slip up. But she couldn't afford to slip up, not with so much on the line. The night passed slowly. Grishka tried to sleep but found it difficult. Her mind kept returning to the same thoughts. The aliens, the destruction they had already left in their wake. The ship that had brought the exiles back to Verda had seen the first signs of the alien fleet. Massive ships with weapons capable of wiping out entire cities. The threat was real, and they didn't have much time. At dawn, Grishka stood up, ready for the day. She felt the weight of her mission pressing down on her shoulders. This was more than just a chance to gain the settlers' trust. This was about survival. The future of her people, and possibly the future of the settlers, depended on it. Aska gathered the group. "We'll head east. There's a resource-rich valley there. We'll need to collect what we can. Stay alert." Grishka nodded. She knew the area, at least a little. Her crew had done reconnaissance when they first arrived, But the situation had changed since then. The settlers had learned how to survive in this harsh environment. The exiles had relied on technology, but now they were being forced to depend on their skills and knowledge. The group set off, walking through the thick woods that surrounded the settlement. The path was narrow and winding. With trees that grew so close together, it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As they walked, Grishka's thoughts wandered back to the aliens. It had been months since they first encountered the mysterious ships, and the closer they got to Verda, the more certain she became that the invasion was coming. The aliens weren't just looking for a new planet. They were looking for something more. They were hunting for resources, something that Verda had in abundance. Grishka didn't know what it was, but she could feel it in her bones. The aliens were getting closer, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. As they approached the valley, Aska motioned for the group to halt. "Keep your eyes open," she said in a low voice. "We don't know what we'll find." The group spread out, looking for signs of the aliens' presence. Grishka moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the trees and the ground for any clues. The air was thick with tension. She could feel it in her chest, the weight of the unknown. What if the aliens were already here? What if they were watching them from the shadows? Suddenly, one of the settlers, a young man named Jorik, shouted, "Commander, over here." Grishka hurried over, her heart racing. Jorik was kneeling by a large tree, pointing at something on the ground. It looked like a footprint, but it was unlike anything Grishka had ever seen before. The print was deep, almost as if something heavy had pressed down into the earth. It was shaped like an elongated triangle, with sharp, angular edges. "What is that?" Aska asked, crouching beside them. "It's not human," Grishka said quietly, "and it's not any animal we've seen around here." The settlers exchanged nervous glances. Aska frowned. "Do you think they're already here?" Grishka's mind raced. The print was fresh, meaning the aliens had passed through here recently. She didn't know if they were close or just scouting, but one thing was clear: the threat was real, and it was imminent. She had no idea how much time they had left. "We need to get back to the settlement," Grishka said. "We need to warn everyone, and we need to prepare for the worst." As they made their way back to the settlement, Grishka's mind was spinning. The print they had found was just the beginning. The aliens were close, and if they didn't act quickly, it might already be too late. When they arrived back at the settlement, the mood was tense. Grishka could see the fear in the eyes of the settlers. They had been living in peace for so long, but now that peace was being threatened. Aska immediately called a meeting with the leaders of the settlement. "We've seen signs," Grishka said, standing in front of the group. "The aliens are close. They've already begun their search for resources. If we don't act now, they'll destroy everything we've worked for." Aska turned to the group. "We've worked hard to get to this point. We can't just give up now. But we need to know what we're up against. How can we fight back?" Grishka felt the weight of the question. The settlers had no weapons, no advanced technology. But she had seen their strength. They had survived on their own for 10 years. They had built something strong. And now, they had to fight to protect it. "We need to unite," Grishka said firmly. "We may not have all the resources, but we have the will to survive. Together, we can make a stand. We've seen the alien ships. They're massive, but they're not invincible. If we can find a way to fight back, we have a chance." The settlers exchanged uncertain looks, but Grishka could see the spark of hope in their eyes. They had fought for so long to survive. Maybe, just maybe, they could fight again. The following days felt like a blur to Grishka. The settlers had sprung into action with a mix of caution and determination. They weren't soldiers, but they were resourceful, skilled in ways Grishka had forgotten during her years in the exile fleet. They had lived without the luxury of technology for so long, relying instead on the tools nature had provided them. And Grishka found herself in awe of their adaptability. If they were going to stand a chance against the alien threat, it would be because of their ingenuity, not advanced weapons. Grishka spent her time working closely with Aska and the settlement leaders, helping them formulate a plan. Their priority was defense. If the aliens were coming, they needed to protect the settlement. Grishka had recommended setting up barricades and reinforcing key areas, but the settlers were not convinced. They didn't want to trap themselves in a fight they couldn't win. They needed something more, something that could give them a fighting chance. "We need more than just walls," Grishka said, standing with Aska and Jorik near the edge of the settlement. "We need to fight back with strategy, not just brute force." Aska glanced at her. "We have no weapons, no technology. What strategy are you talking about?" Grishka's mind was spinning. She had seen the alien ships. She had seen their power. They weren't like anything the exiles had encountered before. If they didn't outthink the aliens, they wouldn't stand a chance. But the settlers, they had something the exiles didn't, a deep understanding of the land, of how to survive in a place like Verda. It was time to use that to their advantage. "We can't fight them head-on," Grishka said slowly, trying to form a plan. "But we know the terrain. We can use that. We can create traps, set ambushes, and make it harder for them to find us. We can use the environment to hide, to confuse them. We'll make it so they never know where we are." Aska studied her for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "You're asking us to play a game of hide-and-seek with an alien army." "I'm asking you to survive," Grishka replied. "We can't defeat them with force, but we can outsmart them. You've lived here for 10 years. You know this place better than anyone. You can hide in the forests, in the caves, and use the land to your advantage. They'll have to waste time searching for us. It gives us a chance to strike back when the moment is right." Jorik stepped forward, his eyes filled with doubt. "And what do we do when they find us? When they attack?" Grishka didn't have an answer. The truth was, she didn't know what would happen if the aliens found them. She had seen the alien ships. They were huge, powerful, and fast. The weapons they carried could destroy entire settlements in an instant. If they came here, there would be no time for second chances. She had to make sure the settlers understood that the stakes were high. "We fight," she said, her voice firm. "We fight to protect our homes, our families, everything we've worked for. But we do it on our terms. We take the fight to them, and we do it carefully. Every move counts." Aska didn't respond immediately. She just nodded, her eyes still filled with uncertainty. It was clear she wasn't fully convinced, but Grishka knew that there wasn't time for hesitation. The aliens were coming, and if they didn't act quickly, it would be too late. The next morning, the group gathered at the edge of the settlement, preparing for their first strike. The plan was simple. They would move quickly and quietly, using the dense forests around them for cover. They would set traps along the way, camouflaged pits, tripwires, and hidden snares. They would make the aliens believe they were surrounded by more than just a handful of settlers. Grishka looked over the group, Aska, Jorik, and the others, and felt a rush of determination. They weren't soldiers, but they were something better. They were survivors, and if anyone could outsmart the aliens, it was them. They moved through the forest in small groups, working quickly to set up their defenses. Grishka led one team, directing them to places where they could hide their traps. It was slow work, but they had to be careful. One mistake could cost them everything. By late afternoon, they had finished the first phase of their plan. The traps were in place, and the settlers had spread out, ready to take their positions. Grishka stood with Aska, watching the horizon. She had a sinking feeling in her stomach. The silence was unsettling. The aliens had made no move yet. Were they waiting? Watching? "I don't like this," Aska said quietly, standing next to her. "It feels like we're just waiting to be found." Grishka nodded. "I know, but we have to trust the plan. We can't make a move until they do." As if on cue, the sky darkened. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance, and Grishka's heart skipped a beat. The aliens were coming. The first of the alien ships appeared on the horizon, a dark shape against the setting sun. It was massive, its sleek design like nothing Grishka had ever seen. The ship glided through the air with an eerie silence, as if it didn't need to make a sound. It was followed by others, forming a small fleet that blocked out the sky. Grishka's breath caught in her throat. They were here. Aska turned to her, eyes wide. What do we do now? Grishka's mind raced. The time for hiding was over. They had to move, and fast. The traps would slow the aliens down, but it wouldn't be enough to stop them entirely. The settlers had one chance, and they had to make it count. Everyone, get into position, Grishka shouted. This is our fight now. We take the battle to them. The settlers, their faces grim but determined, scattered into the woods. Grishka stayed close to Aska, watching the approaching ships. The first wave of aliens would be entering the area soon. And this time, they weren't going to wait for the enemy to make the first move. The first alien ship descended rapidly from the sky, its dark hull cutting through the air with a low humming sound. Grishka's heart raced as she signaled for everyone to remain hidden. The settlers had done their best to conceal themselves, but the aliens were fast, and they were advanced. Grishka felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she watched the ship slowly land in the clearing ahead. The plan was simple: use the traps they had set and lure the aliens into them. But as the ships landed, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The traps were just a delay tactic. They weren't enough to stop the aliens if the invasion force was as large as it seemed. Grishka's gaze shifted to the other ships, which were now hovering in place, waiting. She could only hope their plan would buy them enough time to make a real stand. The settlers had scattered into the surrounding trees, each group taking the specific position near the traps. Grishka was at the edge of the clearing with Aska and a few others. Their job was to remain hidden until the aliens were deep enough in the area to trigger the traps. Then, they would strike. As they waited, the sound of footsteps echoed from the trees. Grishka tensed, every muscle in her body coiled with nervous energy. It was hard to imagine the aliens weren't already aware of them. The idea of ambushing an enemy with this much technology seemed impossible, but the settlers had done everything they could to prepare. And now it was all about execution. The alien soldiers disembarked from their ships. They were tall, their bodies encased in armored suits that shimmered in the fading light. They moved with a calculated grace, their eyes scanning the environment with a precision Grishka found unnerving. It wasn't the kind of enemy you could outfight with sheer strength. It wasn't even clear if they could be outsmarted. But Grishka had seen what happened to those who underestimated the settlers. They would fight until the very end, no matter how impossible it seemed. Now, Grishka whispered, watching the first alien soldier step into one of the traps. The ground beneath it gave way, and the alien plunged into a pit hidden by branches and leaves. The trap had worked. It wasn't enough to kill, but it was enough to slow them down. The alien let out a strange sound, a mix between a growl and a hiss, as it struggled to climb out. That was when the first volley of fire came from the settlers. Hidden from view, they fired makeshift slingshots and spears, sending projectiles flying through the air. One of the settlers' arrows pierced the alien's armor, making the creature recoil in pain. The soldiers quickly responded, their armored suits glowing as they raised weapons of their own. But they were disoriented, unsure of where the attack was coming from. The settlers had made sure to keep their positions well hidden. The ambush had worked. Grishka's pulse quickened as she saw Aska throw a handful of small devices into the air. They detonated with a bright flash, temporarily blinding the aliens and disorienting them further. This was their chance. The settlers, using their knowledge of the land and the alien soldiers' confusion, began closing in. Grishka dashed through the underbrush, her legs moving quickly but quietly. She reached the pit where the first alien had fallen and saw that it was still struggling to escape. It was a clear shot. Grishka pulled her makeshift bow back. aiming for the creature's head. She exhaled slowly and let the arrow fly. It struck with a satisfying thud, piercing the alien's helmet. The soldier went still, its body collapsing into the pit with a thud. One down, Grishka muttered under her breath, though the victory felt bittersweet. There were more to come. The other aliens quickly regrouped, realizing they were under attack. Their advanced weaponry came to life, beams of energy lighting up the forest as they fired in every direction. The settlers, anticipating the attack, ducked behind trees and rocks, using the terrain to shield themselves. Grishka had been right about one thing. The aliens weren't prepared for this kind of guerrilla warfare. The alien soldiers quickly adapted, their movements more coordinated now. They began pushing forward, forcing the settlers to retreat further into the woods. It wasn't the victory they had hoped for, but it was a chance to regroup. Grishka signaled to Aska, who immediately relayed the order to the others. "Fall back to the secondary position," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. The settlers pulled back, retreating through the trees with expert precision. They weren't running away. They were moving strategically, leading the aliens into another series of traps. Grishka was proud of how quickly they adjusted to the situation. They were learning from each move, improving with every second. It wasn't enough to defeat the aliens just yet, but they were holding their ground. After a tense few minutes, the alien soldiers reached the secondary trap site. The settlers had placed heavy logs along the path, ready to drop them at the right moment. Grishka was watching from a concealed position with Aska when she saw the first log fall. It crashed down with a loud boom, knocking several of the soldiers off their feet. Now the real fight began. The aliens, though disoriented, recovered quickly. They began to fight back in earnest, using their superior technology to blast through the trees and strike at anything that moved. Grishka could hear the sounds of combat, the clash of primitive tools against high-tech weaponry. She knew that if they were going to win, they had to outsmart the aliens at every turn. "Stay low," Grishka whispered to Aska, who nodded and crouched beside her. "We need to be ready for their counterattack." The settlers kept fighting, retreating when necessary, but always striking back when the opportunity arose. Grishka felt her chest tighten as she realized just how much was at stake. They had to win this battle. If they didn't, everything they had worked for, their lives, their homes, their future would be destroyed. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Grishka could feel the hope in the air. The settlers weren't just defending their home. They were fighting for their right to live. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves. The battle raged on, but Grishka knew that this was just the beginning. The first wave had been repelled, but there was more to come. The aliens wouldn't stop until they had everything they wanted. And Grishka, along with the settlers, would keep fighting, no matter the cost. The battle had dragged on longer than anyone expected. The settlers, though brave and resourceful, were beginning to show signs of fatigue. Their ambush tactics had worked in the beginning, but now the alien forces were adapting. The sheer power of the enemy's technology was overwhelming, and even with their superior knowledge of the terrain, the settlers were slowly being pushed back. Grishka crouched behind a large boulder, watching the battle unfold. The air was thick with the sound of blaster fire and explosions. Trees were being torn apart by the energy blasts, and the once serene forest had turned into a war zone. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago, this place had been home to the exiles, peaceful, quiet, and isolated. Aska knelt beside her, her face grim. "They're not giving up," she said, her voice low. "We knew they wouldn't," Grishka replied, trying to focus. "But we can't back down either." The aliens had learned from the first wave of attacks. They were now more cautious, moving in small groups, their weapons scanning for any signs of movement. Their armor was nearly impenetrable, and their weapons could tear through trees and rocks with ease. The settlers, on the other hand, had no such advantage. Their best chance was to outsmart them, to keep moving and making them waste time searching for them. Grishka had been watching closely, looking for any signs of weakness. The aliens were formidable, but they weren't invincible. There was one thing she had noticed. They relied heavily on their technology, their sensors, and their weapons. They didn't expect the settlers to fight back the way they were. They weren't prepared for guerrilla tactics. "We need to keep them off balance," Grishka said, standing up from her hiding place. "We need to draw them into a trap, one they can't escape from." Aska looked at her with a mixture of worry and admiration. "What do you have in mind?" Grishka smiled, though it was a cold, calculated expression. "We've been letting them chase us through the forest. It's time we turn the tables. We'll make them think they've cornered us, but when they do, we'll hit them hard." Aska raised an eyebrow. "You want to fight them head-on?" "No," Grishka said firmly. "I want them to think they've won. I want them to think they've got us trapped, and then we'll show them just how wrong they are." It was a risky plan, but it was the only one that had any chance of success. The settlers had to take the fight to the aliens, surprise them, outsmart them, and strike when they least expected it. Grishka quickly relayed the plan to the others. The settlers would fall back once again, but this time they would guide the aliens into a narrow ravine that had been largely untouched by the battle so far. The ravine was perfect, narrow enough to trap the aliens, with steep sides that made escape nearly impossible. They could force the aliens into it, and then use their remaining resources to launch a final strike. As the settlers began to fall back toward the ravine, Grishka couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They had done their best to fight off the first wave, but this next phase of the plan would require everything they had left. If they didn't succeed, there would be no more hiding, no more running. The aliens would finish what they had started. They moved through the forest quickly, carefully, making sure to leave enough signs of their passage to make it seem like they were retreating. The alien forces followed, their movements slow but steady, their weapons scanning the area for any signs of life. Grishka and Aska led the group, constantly checking their surroundings, making sure the trap was set. The ravine was just ahead. "We're almost there," Grishka whispered, turning to Aska. "Get everyone into position. We don't have much time." Aska nodded and relayed the message to the others. The settlers quickly took up their positions on either side of the ravine, hidden in the trees, waiting for the aliens to come into view. Grishka took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. This was the moment of truth. The aliens had been too confident. Now they would learn that the exiles weren't just survivors, they were fighters. The sound of the alien forces grew louder as they approached the ravine. Grishka's heart beat faster. She could feel the tension in the air, the heavy anticipation. The settlers were ready. They had done everything they could to prepare. Now they would see if their plan could work. As the first alien soldiers reached the entrance of the ravine, Grishka gave the signal. The settlers released their traps. Heavy rocks fell from above, and trees were pulled down, creating barriers that cut off the aliens' escape routes. The alien soldiers reacted quickly, but they were too late. They had been lured in, and now they were trapped. The settlers sprang into action. From their hidden positions, they launched their final attack. Spear-tipped arrows, crude explosives, and fire-tipped projectiles rained down on the aliens. The sudden onslaught caught them off guard, and the aliens struggled to find cover. Their high-tech armor, while impressive, wasn't enough to protect them from the chaos. Grishka and Aska led the charge, running into the fray with weapons drawn. The settlers fought with everything they had, using the environment to their advantage, forcing the aliens into the narrow space where their technology was less effective. Grishka could hear the crackle of the alien weapons, but they were no longer as confident. The settlers had taken the upper hand. For the first time since the battle began, Grishka felt hope rise in her chest. The aliens were being pushed back, their movements clumsy as they tried to regroup. The settlers were winning, slowly but surely. But the battle wasn't over. Grishka knew that even though the aliens were trapped, they wouldn't give up easily. The tide had turned, But it wasn't a victory yet. They still had to finish the fight. She looked around at the settlers, exiles who had once been outcasts, now standing tall as warriors. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their freedom. And in that moment, Grishka knew they would keep fighting until they had it. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of burning wood mixing with the dust of battle. Grishka stood at the edge of the ravine, watching as the last of the alien soldiers struggled to regroup. The settlers had given it their all, but now they were exhausted. Many were injured, and their supplies were running low. The final push had come down to this last stand against the invaders who had tried to destroy everything they had built. The battle had raged for hours. The settlers had lured the aliens into the trap and fought with everything they had, but the alien forces weren't easily defeated. They were stronger, faster, and better equipped. Yet, despite all that, the settlers had managed to hold them back, forcing them into a corner where they could make one final push for freedom. Grishka wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes scanning the ravine. The remaining alien soldiers were huddled together, their armor battered and scorched from the barrage of projectiles and traps. They had fought hard, but they hadn't expected this kind of resistance. Now, they were disoriented, cornered, and vulnerable. Aska appeared beside Grishka, her face grim but determined. "We've done everything we can," she said, her voice steadied despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "We just need to finish this." Grishka nodded, her mind racing. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. The aliens still had powerful weapons, and though they had been pushed back, they could easily turn the tide of the battle if given the chance. "We'll do it together," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is our last chance. We fight until the very end." Aska nodded and turned to rally the remaining settlers. "Get ready," she called out. "We have one final push. Stick together, stay close, and we'll end this today." The settlers moved into position, their makeshift weapons at the ready. Grishka glanced over at the alien forces. They were regrouping, but the damage had been done. Their numbers had thinned, their lines broken, and their morale shattered. Grishka could see it in their eyes. They were no longer the confident, organized force they had been at the start of the battle. Now, they were simply trying to survive. The first move came from the settlers. With a rallying cry, they charged forward, using the cover of trees and rocks to stay hidden until the last moment. The aliens fired their energy weapons, but the settlers were fast, ducking and weaving between obstacles, their attacks swift and precise. The settlers' movements were sharp, their knowledge of the terrain giving them an advantage in the close quarters of the ravine. Grishka moved at the front, leading the charge. She had been through countless battles in her life, but none like this one. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for their right to exist, for their right to live without fear of oppression. She couldn't afford to lose, not now, not after everything they had sacrificed. The first alien soldier fell to the ground, an arrow piercing its armor. The rest of the group hesitated for a moment, shocked by the sudden onslaught. The settlers pressed forward, pushing the aliens deeper into the ravine. The terrain was becoming more difficult for the invaders. The steep sides of the ravine worked against them, limiting their movement. The settlers were nimble, using the environment to their advantage. Grishka felt a surge of adrenaline as she ran. She was faster now, more focused, and the weight of the battle seemed to lift from her shoulders. She could see the alien leader now, standing at the back of the group, barking orders. He was large, his armor gleaming in the fading light. He was the last obstacle, the final piece standing between them and victory. Grishka's heart raced. If they could take out the leader, the rest of the aliens would likely surrender. The leader was the key to their victory. With a sharp motion, Grishka signaled to the others. Aska and the other settlers formed a line, providing cover as Grishka made her move. She darted from behind one of the large rocks, her eyes locked on the alien leader. The leader noticed her immediately, his glowing eyes narrowing in recognition. He raised his weapon, preparing to fire. But Grishka was faster. She hurled a spear with all her might, the sharp tip cutting through the air with deadly precision. The leader's armor was strong, but it wasn't invincible. The spear struck its mark, piercing through a weak spot in the armor. The alien leader let out a cry of pain as he fell to his knees. The alien forces hesitated, their leader's fall sending shockwaves through their ranks. The settlers took advantage of this moment of doubt. They pressed forward, striking with renewed energy. The aliens, now disorganized and leaderless, fought with desperation. But it was too late. The settlers had them cornered. One by one, the alien soldiers fell. The settlers worked together, each blow coming faster and harder than the last. There was no hesitation now. They were fighting for their homes, for their families, for their future. Grishka stood at the front of the charge, her breath coming in quick, heavy gasps. She looked around at the faces of the settlers, exiles, survivors, warriors, and saw the determination in their eyes. This was their fight. This was their moment. They had come from nothing, cast aside by those who should have protected them. And now they were taking back their freedom. The last of the aliens fell to the ground, their weapons scattered across the ravine. Grishka looked around, her heart pounding in her chest. It was over. The settlers stood victorious. Grishka dropped to her knees, exhaustion flooding through her body. She had fought hard, but it had been worth it. The invaders were defeated, their forces scattered. The ravine was quiet now, save for the sounds of the settlers catching their breath. Aska approached, a smile breaking across her face. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with relief. Grishka nodded, her eyes scanning the battlefield. "We did," she said quietly. "We fought for our home. And now, we have it." The settlers gathered together, their faces weary but filled with pride. They had faced impossible odds, and now they had won. They had shown the aliens that they would never give up, never surrender, and never stop fighting for their right to live in peace. It was over. The exiles had reclaimed their freedom, and with it, they had secured their future.